We'll be pleased to hear from you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to participate in today's hearing. I'm Ann Smith, a Vice President of CRA International. My testimony today represents my own research and opinions. It does not represent any positions of CRA. Cap and trade is one possible form of a market-based approach to regulation. These approaches can be very effective for reducing emissions at lowest possible cost. But to be effective, cap and trade must be tailored, not worn off the rack. I'll explain why a good greenhouse gas cap and trade program should not look just like a SO2 program on steroids. If we design it that way, we will run into at least 3 serious problems. First, emissions allowance prices are notoriously volatile. Emissions traders love that volatility, but consumers do not. For SO2, the volatility had little effect on final costs passed through to consumers. Prices on CO2 emissions, however, will more readily appear in consumers' costs of living. For example, the carbon price swings that have occurred in the EU ETS so far have caused the cost of coal-fired electricity generation to rise and fall by almost 200%. It is not entirely coincidental that the average EU business's electricity rates across the whole EU rose by 16% in 2005. So clearly, a well-designed cap and trade program must eliminate such price spikes. This can be done by letting the government sell extra permits at a pre-established, affordable price to anybody who wants to buy them. It can be done even more easily and simply using other market-based approaches, such as emission fees. The second problem of copying the SO2 model relates to the international dimension of greenhouse gases, which is not a concern for SO2. The fact that a price on CO2 directly increases costs of production means that domestic businesses will see their costs increasing as the price of carbon is added, and it will make them less able to compete with their competitors in uncapped countries. If we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions domestically, but they are offset by increases elsewhere in the world, large sums of money could be spent by us on controls with no actual environmental benefit. The bottom line, any domestic cap and trade program that is implemented in advance of internationally coordinated efforts should be designed with permit price caps, and low ones at that. Third, in contrast to SO2 and NOx, greenhouse gas sources come from a wide, vast array of sources. Covering all of these sources is not possible with a cap that is imposed at the point where emissions occur, as we do with SO2. Imagine imposing a cap on all automobile tailpipes. Fortunately, there's actually a very simple way to achieve nearly universal coverage of greenhouse gases. Cap them upstream before they are ever even emitted. How? By capping carbon in the fossil fuels rather than capping the emissions as those fuels are burned. The EU ETS program followed the SO2 model by capping CO2 at the point of emission or downstream rather than upstream. As a result, that cap covers less than half of EU's greenhouse gas emissions. The other half continues to grow, making it very likely that the EU may not meet its emissions targets. An upstream approach could have covered those other emissions too. The upstream approach is neither radical nor novel. It was used successfully in 2 of our earliest cap and trade programs, for the phase down of lead in gasoline and the phase out of chlorofluorocarbons. Some are concerned that an upstream approach, they're concerned about an upstream approach because they think that it will affect their permit allocations. You can completely separate the decision about the point of regulation from any decisions about who should receive the permit allocations. And I think that you should make this separation very clearly. In summary, there are reasonable approaches that will work for a greenhouse gas cap, but they look very different from the widely touted SO2 and NOx cap and trade programs. Unfortunately, many policymakers want to run away from the market-based approaches and go back to prescriptive regulations. This would be very costly. For example, I've estimated that a renewable portfolio standard as an alternative to a cap would cost 4 times as much as any simple pure cap and trade program to produce the same amount of emissions reductions. I close on the need for more and better R&D. Market-based policies stimulate innovation that is incremental in nature and deployment of emerging new technologies. But sadly, and contrary to widespread belief, cap and trade programs cannot stimulate the kinds of technological progress that are necessary to enable the much, much deeper emissions cuts that are required to achieve climate stabilization. And the current preoccupation with how to impose near-term greenhouse gas controls is crowding out attention to this much more important bottleneck for reducing climate change risks. Thank you very much for your time. There are more details in my written comments, which will be in the record, I hope.
Thank you, Dr. Smith.